Okay, so before we talk about the Archive of American Television, off camera we were talking about some of the specific interviews you did for the box. So first of all, we got some of the names that we were searching for earlier. The actress who with the falsies.
That was Bethel Leslie.
Okay.
And yeah, Bethel Leslie got fitted for falsies for a Western, and she had been a live TV actress, and that, to her, that just showed her how television was changing. And she was also very gracious. She was quite sick when she saw me. I don't think she had long to live, but she wanted. I think a lot of people were like that, where they knew that I was the way that they were going to keep it going for them, and they did. And it just, I'm sorry, jump around, but one of the things I was thinking about when we were talking about this was that I always have in my head a sort of a little. I just store away, you know, who is gracious and who wasn't, and who treats me well and who it's just fascinating when you come to somebody's house, when you're doing oral history or their place of work, how do they treat you? And that, for some reason, was always important to me. I always, and to me, it's always a lesson. Anybody who comes to the house, I treat the way I would want to be treated. And this goes back to an interview I did with Barney Josephson, who was the owner of Cafe Society in the first interracial nightclub in New York, and who was famous, you know, left-wing circles in the 50s and 60s and 40s, 50s, and 60s. I interviewed him at his restaurant, and a day it was 95 or 100 degrees outside, and I don't think he kept the air conditioning on because he was too cheap. And he sat there and knocked down one iced tea after another and didn't offer me a glass of water. And ever since then, I keep a little track. And so Ted Bergman, who's the head of Dumont, he made lunch for me. You know, it wasn't like he had somebody make lunch for me. He just did. And Bob Lewine, who lived in a pink house in Beverly Hills, the former head of, he just went out of his way to make me feel comfortable in his home and to welcome me and to show how appreciative he was. He wasn't doing me a favor. He was happy to talk to me. And there were a lot of people like that, and especially the people who weren't in front of the cameras. But as I said, Murray Amsterdam, he just had such a good time. You could tell, and he treated me that way. And occasionally you get somebody who just treats you like dirt, and you note that too. And that happened, you know, often enough. I don't go out at this thinking that I'm a genius, because I'm not. I don't go at this thinking that I've got all the answers or I can ask the right questions. And a lot of times I just ask dumb questions, or because I wasn't there, because some of this stuff was before I was there, before I was alive, I didn't experience it. You know, it's based on research, and I'd get things wrong. And sometimes they would talk to you like, you know, you're an idiot, which, you know, might have been true, but I didn't really want to be made to be felt that way. And other times, 2 or 3 times somebody would say to me, oh, they're the nicest person in television. One of them was Hugh Downs. And I contacted Hugh Downs, and he was on the set of 2020. And I asked him if we could talk, and he said, how about now? And he gave me as long as I wanted. He would tell, I could hear him talking to people in the background saying, no, I'm doing something important, I can't deal with it right now. And he just patiently answered every question that I had. And he didn't have to do that. Imogene Coca invited me to her house on the Upper East Side, and people said, oh, Imogene Coca, oh, they were loved Imogene Coca. She was as nice as she was said to have been. So was Barbara Billingsley. I'd love to get that on. Barbara Billingsley was as nice as June Cleaver was. I'd like to get that on the record. There was Greg Garrison, who was a tough guy director, who was so interesting and so wonderful. We started early in the afternoon. By the time we were done at night, we were sitting in the dark in his office. And I had to find the tape recorder because I couldn't see the tape recorder. I didn't know where it was by the time I turned it off and the interview was over. And maybe the most saintly person was probably Norman Felton, who was a producer was on live television in the 50s, and in the 60s was a producer. And Norman's daughter and son-in-law, I think that's who were murdered by drug dealers. And Norman was in the police station, and they said, well, you know, we got these guys, and, you know, if you want, of course, you favor the death penalty for them. And Norman just said, no, that's not going to give me any kind of satisfaction. It's not about revenge. It's not going to make me happier. And he funded a group about victims against the death penalty. I mean, imagine the courage and imagine the decency that went into that. And you know, that was Norman. Norman gave me his autobiography afterward, and he wanted me to try to publish it, and I wasn't able to do it. And I always took that failure personally. I really wanted to help Norman. I wanted to do whatever he could. He was just such a nice man. I hate, you know, thinking that, you know, I did somebody wrong. Greg Garrison was probably the only person who accused me of writing something that he said was off the record. And I went and listened to the tape. Something else came to me. And I listened to the tape, and it wasn't true. And it wasn't off the record. But he wouldn't talk to me again. In fact, he burned my ears pretty well. And then somebody else did too. One of the people who worked on Howdy Doody, when we talked about Princess Winterfall, Summer, Spring, or Princess Summer, Spring, Winterfall, I can't remember how it was, and who had a reputation of sleeping around like crazy. And one of the people who worked there told me about this. And then when it came out in print, screamed at me that how dare I do something like that, that he'll regret forever letting me into his home. And what a, you know, basically I was a disgusting person, but he told me that story. You know, he was a reporter himself. He knew he knew what on the record and off the record was. He never asked me not to print it. He never asked me to turn off the tape recorder. He told me that story with great glee, and then apparently was a bit embarrassed when I actually quoted him accurately. And it's probably one of the few times somebody really yelled at me for being accurate, you know, in my quote. Doesn't really happen as a reporter very often. And I lost my train of thought.
Well, we were just talking about the various people. Off camera, we were talking about the See It Now episode on McCarthy. So
because I'm a journalist, and Fred Friendly taught at the school when I went to school, and I met him a couple of times. At that point, he was a little into maybe being Fred Friendly at that point. But Fred Friendly and Ed Murrow's records, I Can Hear It Now, it was on those records that I heard for the first time about Alger Hiss when I was a kid. And that got me interested. Edward Murrow said one of these two men is the greatest liar in the history of congressional investigations. And I was always fascinated by which was it, Alger Hiss or Whittaker Chambers, and eventually that changed my life. And Fred Friendly produced those records. And Edward R. Murrow, like for many young journalists, was a hero because of his London broadcast during World War II, and then, of course, he took on McCarthy. And so Joe Wershba was somebody who was a friend of Alger Hiss, and he got me in touch with Palmer Williams, with Millie Bonsignori, and a couple of other people who worked at CBS. And I was able to recreate the feelings in that room when Murrow took on Joe McCarthy. And they all were worried that their lives, their professional lives, were over that night. And Murrow insisted that they go ahead anyway, that this was important. And it turned out to be the end of the beginning of the end of Murrow's career at CBS, because it was William Paley who said, "I get a stomach ache every time you're on the air," and they gradually reduced because that show was extremely important. But Murrow basically threw himself under the bus for the American people, and was no longer after that the power at CBS News. They gradually reduced his role to almost nothing back then. And one of the things that Paley complained about, and it's an interesting, and I think Frank Stanton too, which said, this is the first time we're weaponizing television. And, you know, they were weaponizing it for a good reason. Somebody needed to take on McCarthy, and Murrow believed that they had an obligation to do it. But by doing that, they opened up a door which we've never been able to close since. It's a really good question about about the wisdom of doing that show in the long run.
Another name we were talking about was your Al Friedman interview.
Al Friedman was the producer of 21. He had done a couple of other quiz shows. He had been a Marine during World War II in combat. He was, when I saw him, Al Friedman was a sexologist.
Did he define what that was?
No, he did not, but he worked at Penthouse Magazine, and I got to go to the Penthouse offices on the West 60s in New York. And there wasn't anything about them that would distinguish Penthouse from anything else, other than a couple of things on the wall that said he had a degree in sexology. And I don't know what he was expert at, but I really wasn't going to ask. And we immediately liked each other. Al had not talked to anybody about this. He was the only person to go to jail for lying to the grand jury. He did it to protect Charles Van Doren, and then they threw him under the bus for that. And he was prosecuted by another very nice man named Joe Stone, who was also living on the Upper West Side at that time. And Al sort of never recovered from, he was sort of like a scared rabbit. He didn't really want to talk. But he trusted me for some reason, and I was going to tell his story. And he was very pleased when the book came out and got to tell the story. And he also gave me an autobiography, which I have sitting on the table over there. I was never able to do anything with. He also, once a year, would sort of get drunk and call me on the phone after this interview. And "Hi, Jeff, this is Al, and then you're the greatest. You did things," and it would just be this maudlin conversation. And I felt terrible for him, and after a while I stopped taking the calls. But one of the things that I did was, he was so troubled that, and I liked Joe Stone so much, I got the two of them together to have lunch. Joe was very interested in having lunch with Al, and Al was not interested in having lunch with Joe. But I convinced them to do that, and I have a recording of the lunch. I taped the whole thing. I thought it would make a good New Yorker piece. And the two of them sat down, and it was a very warm, very friendly, very nice lunch, and I think Al felt a lot better afterward. I remember Michael Stipe from REM was sitting at the next table, and I kept thinking, well, yeah, that might be fun to be sitting there, but this is a lot more interesting than that would be. And then Al was hurt terribly when Quiz Show came out, the movie, Robert Redford, because they used his real name and they turned him into a cartoonish character. And Herb Stempel also wasn't happy about it either. But Al was especially unhappy about it because he felt that they took all these liberties with his character and who he was. And I thought he had a good argument, that they didn't change his name. It wasn't Al, but yet they used, there it was, Al Friedman on stage, and he was humiliated. And I went on the air to a few shows. I think Steve Ducey, Donald Trump's best friend, they had me on a show in New Jersey saying basically, yeah, look, they have a right to take liberties with a story. They're making a movie, I get it. But when they're using somebody's real name and that person is still alive, that's not fair. And Al was a good guy. he was doing what basically they told him to do. You know, let's make Charles Van Doren the hero. And as he said, that's the way all quiz shows were run pretty much in those days, and he was right.
Did you try to interview Charles Van Doren?
I did. I couldn't, you know, he was alive, and he may still be alive for all I know, but no, I wouldn't. I couldn't. I tried, couldn't get talk to me. I think Reggie Rose, maybe it was Reggie Rose who was trying. He said that they were next door neighbors, and he said, I'll tell you one thing about Charles Van Doren. He said he cheats at tennis. The other thing Reggie Rose said was going out for Chinese food with Woody Allen. Woody Allen is the only person he ever went to Chinese food with who doesn't share. I loved Reggie Rose. He was great fun. The Stemple I really liked. Gil Cates, Gil Cates was the producer of several of those TV shows. And he was the only person to record my interview with him. Why he didn't explain, or maybe it was trying to intimidate me. And I felt like he wasn't telling me the truth about the quiz shows during that interview. It was one of the few interviews I felt uncomfortable doing, not because I was being recorded, but because I felt like a person wasn't being honest with me. And the irony is that his brother Joe Cates, who was Phoebe's father, who was involved in a lot of early film TV, was somebody who I contacted, and he said, sure, come on down. And I saw him at his office, I think in the West 50s someplace. And he was a blast. And that interview, he had to go after 2 hours, and I followed him up the street, and I remember just writing notes as I was talking, just trying to get down all the great things that he was saying after the interview, which of course happens a lot when you're doing oral history. Is, you know, you're sitting there, you're talking to somebody, you're recording them, and it's going great, the interview is over, and then they start telling you stories. And then you got to tell the story again, or you got to get it down, and or you have to look and no, and you have to remember it, and then you have to make sure to go back and ask them about it. That certainly happens a lot, and I guess it says something about a recorder being on and people feeling pressure to be on. He was one of those guys who the interview after the interview was as good as the interview itself. There were 3 or 4 people who I talked to who I thought had a book in them. Mike Dan, who did try to write a book, Joe Cates, Greg Garrison. I thought these people should, they don't need to lean on me for anything. They were terrific storytellers with great stories to tell.
When you felt that Gil wasn't being completely honest, did you interject at all, or just let him talk?
No, I did. And I'd have to listen to the interview again. It was, I think it got a little, well, it wasn't, I wouldn't say combative. I don't remember it being combative. I just think my doubt probably about certain things were coming through. It just was an odd thing that he would record the interview. Why? Was he going to sue me? You know, I don't think so. I've never been accused of misquoting anybody, just accused of quoting people accurately in a couple of situations. The Howdy Doody person was somebody whose name escapes me. It's the fellow who covered O.J. Simpson, wrote several books. He wrote it for Esquire. Name will come to me later. But I do have a letter from him, basically, you know, saying how he regrets having me in his home, and always will. I'm a nice guy.
I think so. Another name we were talking about was Studs Terkel.
So people always would ask me, is Studs Terkel, you know, your hero in a way? And to some degree he was. His oral histories were probably hard times, were the first ones I met. But he always, you know, Studs was always trying to, he really was trying to make a point. I mean, everything was ultimately about socialism with Studs. What people don't know is that he was an actor, and that Studs Place was one of the early great TV shows, and really one of the centerpieces of the Chicago School of Television. And what made Studs Place so great was that the show, which was sort of written or not written by Charlie Andrews, was based on a script that might be 2 lines or 2 paragraphs. And they would do a whole show. Studs goes to the races and his wife gets angry. That's the whole script. And then the 5 of them would do this show based on that. And it would be, you know, live. I mean, of course, they rehearse for a week, but how do you do that live? And how does it come out so well? And, you know, that was sort of the integrity, I think, of Studs and the integrity of a lot of the Chicago school. And I went to see Studs, and it's nerve-wracking as an oral historian to interview Studs Terkel, right? And I go to the radio station in Chicago, and he comes out and he says, "Hey, Jeff, good to see you. I got to go take a crap, and then we'll sit down and talk." So, okay, that's a good way to start. And of course, he knows all the good stories. So you don't have to lead Studs Terkel through an interview. That's definitely one where you just turn on the interview and let it go. And he was as generous a storyteller as anybody. You know, he didn't have to be. He was busy also. And he loved talking about acting. And the Chicago school was so important to him. But being an actor, he recalled listening to the radio to the 1924 Chicago convention on the radio, and he started to reproduce the announcers, "In the great state of Illinois," and Studs would act out all these voices. And then we stayed friendly. I helped him with a couple of interviews for his books, and you know, he had me out to Chicago. Studs paid people for his interviews. I was shocked to hear that. It was a very generous thing because he went and interviewed people who had no money. But, you know, I always wondered sometimes how he got such great stuff out of people. Well, it doesn't help if you give them an envelope with $100 or $200. They use the money, but I was, I'm not going to say pleasantly or unpleasantly surprised. I was surprised when I found that out. And I found that out because I had put him in touch with a friend of mine who You Must Remember This, the person who really made You Must Remember This into a great book. His one story about how he got his name was, you know, when I heard that story, was sort of helped change my life in a way. And when Studs was looking for people in New York, I put him in touch with this fellow Bressi. And should I tell the story?
Sure.
So this guy was in Chelsea, which was a neighborhood in New York, was famous for being an artist and a generous person. He worked at the Hudson Guild. And he had a very unusual name named Bressi Thompson. His first name was Bressi. Well, how did he get the name? He got his name because his father was very poor when he came here and worked on the docks. And he worked with a guy named Gaetano Bressi. And Gaetano Bressi was a kind of an anarchist. And his sister was involved in protests in Italy at the time. And the king put down the protests and his sister was killed. And he told Bressi's father, he said, "I'm going to get even with him. I'm going to go to Italy and I'm going to kill the king." And he did. And after that, the name Bressi was forbidden. You weren't allowed to use that name in Italy for anything because it was like naming somebody Lee Harvey Oswald or something like that. And Bressi's father decided to honor his friend and named his son Bressi.
Wow. So
I heard that story and I became an oral historian.
Did you and Studs actually talk about like the craft of oral history at all?
Boy, that's a great question. And I think I was just too intimidated. I felt like he was uncommonly generous, but I didn't know how much time I would have. And I felt like he was a busy guy and I'm not going to waste his time with questions about the craft. Even though I'm sure he would have been more than happy to talk to me about it. I'm sure he would have. But when you walk in on Studs Terkel, as generous as he is, you don't push it. You know, And I think we did on his radio show. We talked a little bit about it. And I had also read his book, Talking to Myself, which talked a lot about, you know, the recorder, he used the Ewer recorder, which I tried to buy once. And he talked quite a bit about the craft then. I just, people say wonderful things about me as an oral historian, you know, really wonderful things. And I've heard the next that's Turkle, you know, this kind of thing. But I'm sure that, you know, there's a whole academic field of oral history. And none of those, they want nothing to do with me. They just, I don't do it in an academic, I don't do it the way that they think it should be done. I'm just a kind of a seat of the pants guy that likes to hear a good story. And thinks that what these people have to say in terms of their impressions are worth listening to. And I think it worked well for New York when people talked about the events that things that they saw. And it worked well for television because I got a chance to piece together this history just by hearing 400 people talk about what was important to them and how they went about doing it. And it was, any journalist, I think, would have been able to piece together that same story. I don't know if they would have had 6 years, you know, of eating spaghetti and having no money to go do those things. I don't think they would have had necessarily the desire to go after that one story. Maybe that's the one thing I bring to the table, is something is important to me and I just decide to tell that story, whether it was New York, this television, or the 60s. So if anything, that what separates me from other people is that I took years, really years to do this stuff. And I didn't have another, I had a job on the side as an editor, but you know, I had nothing. I borrowed money like crazy just to stay alive, just so I can continue to do this. And there were times when I just gave up. You know, couldn't do it. And I've never recovered from the book. I mean, I physically have not recovered from the effort that it took to write this book. Every writing I've had to do subsequently is much more difficult because of what I went through writing the box.
Was there a code of ethics that you followed for yourself in the interviews?
There is always a code of ethics, and the code of ethics is to quote people accurately, and to make sure that even though you're distilling their story from 3 hours of tape, to make sure that what I put down reflects what they were saying in the larger interview. And that was always very important because you can only use a 10th or a 20th sometimes of what people are telling you. But you don't want to just pick out the good things. You want to, if you're going to pick out and cherry pick what's good, you want to make sure it still accurately reflects their overall attitude and their tone, and that was very, very challenging. And also, you know, they may have been wrong about things, but I didn't want, unless I had somebody else saying that they were wrong, I wouldn't knowingly have anything in there I knew was inaccurate. And I think any journalist, you want to be accurate. You don't want anybody to call you up afterward and say, you didn't tell the truth, you misquoted me, you're a liar. And you know, it's really never happened to me before. I'm here to tell the story, I'm here to tell the story accurately. And it's the story as I see it, but I'm trained to look at it and see what the story is, and then tell that story. And to me, that was the story of television, were all these people behind the scenes who were creating this medium. That to me was how it all came together. Much more important than any kind of dates or anything like that.
Is there kind of a best practices that you have for yourself for oral history now that you've developed?
Become a better listener, to become a really good researcher, and also to pre-interview people. I find that just, I can get a sense pretty early on whether or not they're going to help me, or, you know, be able to talk in ways which tell the story that, you know, I want to tell. it's journalism. It's all the stuff that was grounded into my head at the journalism school. Be accurate, be respectful. Accuracy is really just, I don't know, I can't think of anything that's more important than that. And also keep an eye on the story. What are you trying to tell here? And what's the story? And figure out what the story is, and then tell it. And so, you know, Studs might have a political goal in mind. There was a goal into the box was telling about commercial interest taking over TV. But that story was grounded in a lot of years of research and reading and talking and listening and understanding that that's how the medium changed. Of course, that's how it developed too. Without all those, you know, the infusion of cash, we wouldn't have the great stories that are being told today. There's no question about that. Purity only gets you so far. But yet, you know, you just see how the system has changed in so many ways and not always for the better.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's move to talking about the Archive of American Television and how you got involved. You said you got a phone call when the box came out.
Got a phone call right after the box came out, and I think it may have been Janet Blake, I can't remember, and she said, we read your book and we loved the book and we want to do this for TV. We want to preserve all these voices and we want to get them down and we want to tell it in a way that's different. We don't want to do excerpts, we want to do long form. And it's really important that we preserve these voices just like you're doing. And how do we go about doing it? How do we go about talking to these people and getting these people to sit down? And they came to New York. It may have been Dean Valentine, I can't remember. And we sat down and I told them how I went about writing the book. Invariably, what happens when anybody talks to me about craft or process, they come away less than impressed. So they see the book, they think the book is great, then they meet me and they go, well, yeah, okay, you know, they immediately have sort of better ideas, which is fine. I make no pretense, as I said. And they went back and they started the archive. And I gave them a list of people who they should talk to, who I thought should be interviewed.
With
and
contact info or just a list of
I
names?
think it was a list of names and whatever contact info I had. It's all of my contact info is all on legal pads, which I have in boxes. You know, I have for each chapter, I started a new pad. That was always a big deal. And list the names and the phone numbers. And I think I gave them a few phone numbers, but I think that they, you know, I didn't have to give Tom Sarnoff a phone number. I mean, he pretty much had it. And they formed the archive, and I bowed out. I don't remember who it was. People just rubbed me the wrong way. I'm a New Yorker. I'm like, you know, it's like Bethel Leslie in the Folsey story. I just don't do well in Hollywood. I just don't. I mean, there's just a level of BS that I wasn't interested in. And I didn't care one way or the other whether they started it. It just, all right, you want to do that? That's great. That's fine. Leave me out of it as far as I'm concerned. And then there were these two guys that were producers. So the idea in the beginning, from what I understood, was that there were going to be kiosks and that these interviews would be recorded on kiosks and that they would be in certain libraries and that you could then go to the library and watch the interview on a kiosk. Right?
At the Television Academy?
No, in certain libraries that would buy the service. And they were these two young guys that had developed the software to do this. And then around that time, Michael Rosen got involved. And I got a call from Michael, and I said, no, I'm not interested. But Michael was pretty persistent, and I really liked Michael. I mean, we hit it off well. And he said that maybe they were about to do their first interview. It may have been their first interview with Pam Farnsworth. I don't recall if it was.
The second one, yeah.
Who was the first one? Do you know?
First is Leonard Goldenson.
So, yeah, that's right. And I think I saw Leonard Goldenson too. But I went, and we went with those two guys out to do with Pam. And that sort of solidified my sort of dislike of Hollywood. I loved interviewing Pam. I didn't like the process. But the one thing that impressed me was how serious they were about the interviews and about the lighting, and it would just be just so. And they also handed me a script that I had to ask. And I looked at this script and I just tossed it away. No, I'm not going to pay any attention to this. And as a result, my interviews went on forever, which, you know, a good or a bad thing, of course. But to me, they were interesting, and the people I was talking to, they were fine with it. Dick Smith had tossed that script away, and we spent hours in his garage. That was just fascinating. And then, but Michael was insistent, and Michael, we went down to New Jersey, and he came east, and then it got really interesting because we started to work through my list. And I said to Michael, listen, I understand that you have commercial pressures, that the board is saying, look, we have to do Mary Tyler Moore or somebody like that because that's going to sell the archive. And I said, I get that, but if you don't get to these people, they're unique, they're gone. And you've got to get to them you got to get to them now, because they're the only ones who remember the early days of TV. They're in their 90s. Yeah, they're not going to sell anything, but if you don't get to them, you're lost. They're lost. And Michael was good about it. He would knit in the interviews that I would insist he do, but along with more commercial people, until it got to Milton DeLugg. And Michael and I would have this, I mean, this would go on for months or even years probably. And I would say to Michael, I'd get the form and I would write in big letters Milton DeLugg on it, or I would tell Michael, did you go see Milton DeLugg yet? And he'd roll his eyes, you know, he wouldn't see. But eventually they did get to Milton DeLugg, who had he composed, he was a guy that led the orchestra on all these live game shows and became a figure, I think, on the Gong Show. I think he was on camera. And he was a great storyteller. He was a very nice man, and he was in his 90s. And he wasn't going to sell anything, but he was important to get. And there was that sort of central conflict about the archive, which was me saying, you got to get all these people, and the board saying, you know, no, we want to get people we can sell to sell the archive. Well, eventually they got through almost my entire list, I think, without missing too many people. And some of them I did in the beginning, and I sort of enjoyed doing them. And then I got busy and I couldn't really do them. But some people I had met for the first time, you know, that was always wonderful. And they eventually just stopped, you know, doing the interviews. And then Michael, who could be sort of uncommonly generous. I was living up in Westchester, and I had another time in my life where I just had no money. And the only thing I had of value at that point was a brick from Ebbets Field that my grandfather had gotten, and my tapes of all the TV interviews I had done for the box. And Michael offered to buy them. And you know, it's not anything the archive did, and I don't know if they were or would be of any use to anybody, but he did that as an act of generosity, I think, to me. And you know, it took me months to try to organize them. I had them laid out on the floor of my basement, trying to figure out who was on what interview and everything. But eventually, I was, you know, able to put together enough information where they become some use, and we shipped them all off to Michael up, and that's where you have the collection out there. And my wife and I, we were out in California maybe 10 years ago, and we thought we would visit the Jeff Kisseloff collection, which I think impressed her. It was closed. We couldn't visit the Jeff Kisseloff collection, but the person who was in charge of it came out and seemed very pleased to say hello, and that was, you know, kind of cool. There are 2 Jeff Kisseloff collections. There's also a collection at the New York Public Library of my New York interviews. So I have bi-coastal collections. And as far as the interviews go for the archive, I thought the archive's value was the uniqueness of the length of the interviews. I thought it was great that they did it. They were pure in that sense. They sort of reflected a little bit of what I thought was important, and I don't know if that was my influence or not. My only influence is probably being long-winded, as you can tell. But the idea that these would be sort of let people talk, they'd be an unfiltered interview to get the whole story, I think came from my book to some extent. And the idea that that's what their goal was, totally appealed to me. And I thought would make this archive incredibly valuable thing. And then also the interviews were done so well. I'm not talking about the interview process, but the way they were set up, the way they were lit, the professionalism that went into it was foreign to me because, you know, I was just an idiot with a tape recorder and I'd just sit there and turn it on. The idea that they would spend so much time getting this to look just so was not just because it was flattering to the person they were talking to, but it just lent an air of incredible importance to each of the interviews and professionalism to them, which I thought was really, really terrific.
For the people that you had interviewed for your book on audio tape and then the ones you interviewed on video, did people interview differently for audio and video?
Oh, no question about it. That there was, when you're staring at a camera, especially the people, because they were in television, they know what a camera can do and how they're very self-conscious, you know. I had a lot of people say to me, well, it's fine if you bring a tape recorder. This is not for the archive, but I don't want to be on camera. Because people in their 80s, they don't look the way they did when they were younger. They didn't want to be. And so the idea that they would be on camera for this length of time, I think could be unsettling. And so one of the things that I did or tried to do, and one of the reasons why I threw away the scripts, were just to make people feel as comfortable as they could. That forget the camera, this is just a conversation between the two of us. This is not me looking at a script and checking off questions. This is just us chatting. And forget the camera. I can't forget the camera's looking at me. Forget the camera. This is just somebody who's interested hearing your story. And it's a challenge. It really is a great challenge, especially with people in television. But I like to think, you know, it worked. I have to, I am always horrified when I go online and I see myself on the interview. I don't like looking at myself on camera. This is going to be a nightmare.
So you said you do watch them every now and then. Have you kept up with the website and the new interviews?
I do. Well, you know, what'll happen is occasionally if I have to Google, you know, like everybody, I'll Google my name occasionally and it'll say Archive of American Television. I'll go, oh, I didn't realize that was on, and I'll go take a look. And there I am with Joe Wershba, Reuven Frank, or Pam. And you know, I just look at that and go, I can't believe I was that young, you know. It's just horrifying to think that's what I looked like back in those days. And then I hear my voice. And, you know, you asked me earlier, you know, would I go on television or would I think about that? But no, I mean, I have the worst, you know, it's that New York accent that comes through. My goodness, no. And so I hear that voice of my voice in the background, and it's awful. It's, you know, torture for me to listen to it. So I just can't do it. But on the other hand, the interviews are good. They're really good. This archive is so much better than I thought it ever would be. And I did think it was valuable. You know, I wouldn't lie about that. I thought this was a great idea that they had, and it was in line with what I wanted to do. But it's who'd have thought it would have lasted this long, and who'd have thought that it would be, you know, especially for me, it was always about the older people. But occasionally, I'll watch one of the more recent interviews, and they're brilliant. They're great, and you know, I'm just so happy to be a part of. Even with the difficulty in the beginning, you know, I was so sort of honored to be a part of it, and to think that I had something to do with founding it You know, that book, that interview, that story, all of those led to the box. And then the box led to this archive. I mean, you think about that, right? What if I didn't read that story? What if I didn't hear this? Would this have all come together? I don't know. They told me that it was my book that got them started. Well, what if that book wasn't, you know, what if I didn't do any of this stuff, you know? You'd be doing something more interesting this afternoon, you know? I don't know. But it's funny how things happen. My whole publishing career is, you know, came about by accident. Nobody wanted anything, but, you know, just one thing led to another, and I ended up here. In that sense, if my friend Hugo Gellert didn't die and somebody didn't see something and didn't see something, I wouldn't have had the New York book. I wouldn't have had the box, and who knows? You know, it's all sort of a cosmic accident, I guess. Certainly my career is.
Well, on behalf of the archive, thank you for writing that book.
I had a ball. I mean, it was so much work. That book was so hard to do. And yet, there were times where I'd be sitting there listening to the stories and saying, there is no place else that I'd rather be. There is nothing else that I could do that's better than this. How fortunate I am to be able to hear this stuff. And, you know, I was always so grateful. I mean, not everybody was wonderful, and not everybody was interesting. But there were enough of those interviews where you're just overwhelmed by these people, and you just, I'm so lucky to be a journalist and to hear these stories. Wow. Mm-hmm. What a life.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Now, you said you were handed some scripts and threw them out, and you had done a lot of research on your own for the box and knew a lot about these people. Mm-hmm. Did the archive give you any supplemental research on anybody?
They didn't, I recall. I got the scripts, that's it. I didn't get, because I knew the people, and this was the early days, I knew them better than anybody else did. Mm-hmm. The idea of following a script is just completely antithetical to anything I would do. I'm sorry, I knew you got scripted. No. But it and you're not working. You're doing the interviews exactly the way I would. You know, I'm not, you know, I'm not saying I'm so brilliant the way I do it, but you just listen to the conversation and you just let the conversation go where it's going. And so I just found that having scripted questions was completely useless. And I just, to me, and I am sure that, you know, I've probably done maybe 2% of the interviews that they've done, and I'm sure that they are among the 2% of the worst pains in the asses to have done, because I went on too long and because I didn't get what maybe they had in mind. But to me, they were interesting, and to me, the people were always interested in the conversation. So, you know, it works. So the preparation that the archive does, I think, in a lot of cases, invaluable. I'm just self-centered and stubborn, and I just work on my own. I think that was a part of my problem with the archive too. I've never been good with organizations or with people. Writing the box was a sole operation. It was just me and a tape recorder for years, and that worked for me. So they would give me well-researched scripts. A lot of times it was based on my own research, and they just wanted me to catch up on that, cover all the bases, and I would cover them. I'd just get there on my own. Mm-hmm. You know, they wanted me to go up the street and make a left. I wanted to go up a mile, right, make a right, then circle around, come back, and then eventually make that left turn. I always thought that that's what made a really good interview.
Did you learn some gems in the video interviews that you didn't learn in the audio interviews?
Probably. Where you would learn is when they would pull out stuff and show you things. Dick Smith lived in Sarasota, Florida, And I interviewed him in his garage. And you know, he was the greatest makeup man in the history of Hollywood. And we're sitting there, and there's Frankenstein sitting on the table right there, and all the Universal monsters are right there. And Dick is taking me through this stuff, and I think telling me, you know, showing me how he would physically go about doing the makeup, and that I think was really fascinating. Pam gave me the original tube that Phil made that didn't work. She just had sitting on next to the couch or something, and she handed it to me. And somebody took a picture of me holding this tube like you know, like this. I don't want to drop it. What am I going to do? And it was an orange tube which had all these things sticking out. I was just, okay, take it. You know, because for me, I'd end up dropping it or something. And she just, oh, okay, and just went and, put it away. I mean, how amazing is that, holding the first tube that Phil Farnsworth ever made.
It's holding history.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And there's a perfect example of where else would I rather be, right, than sitting here talking to this woman about who was there when the moment that television was invented. Right there. What was the line that he said? The goddamn thing works, right? And she was in the room when that happened. Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I actually misspoke. I think your Elma interview was our 4th and Dick was our 2nd. So you were there right at the very beginning.
Really? Wow. Yeah. Well, that's when Michael sort of dragged me, back into it. I did not do, somebody else did Leonard Goldenson, I know that. It may have been even Tom Sarnoff may have handled that. But the big thing was the list. We worked from that list. And Michael got most of the people on the list. And then there were occasionally I'd see still names from the original list on the ballots. And eventually the ballots, I stopped handing in the ballots because I didn't know. I went from knowing everybody on the list to knowing nobody on the list. And I just felt that, how can I participate? How can I vote? I don't know any of these people. The archive had passed me by, which is fine. That's the way it should be. But it was past my time.
Is there anyone that you would still like to see interviewed? Either current or a classic?
Milton DeLugg, right?
Got him.
I'd have to, I really would have to look at the list again. I don't remember, but I think that they eventually got to everybody who was important. But, we did lose Ted Smith before, and, that's the valuable lesson. I do think it's really important and I tried to talk to Michael about this, is make sure you get the older people first. I get with the other ones, but you have to do, if you have any interest at all, if they're in their 80s and 90s, make it a priority to get to them, because otherwise it's a little tough.
So you mentioned Dick Smith had memorabilia, Alma had the tubes. Was there any talk of the Academy collecting memorabilia or scripts or anything?
No, the opposite. I offered them. I said, I've got all this stuff. Do you want it? And no, they didn't want it. Nobody wanted anything I had. That's why it's been sitting in boxes for years. My publisher didn't even want the pictures. They took the pictures out of my book. So I've just held on to everything. And I would tell Michael and said, Michael, everybody you talk to's got a scrapbook. Everybody's got a picture. Everybody's got a script. And they don't have anybody to hand that to. Collect it and just store it someplace. It's really important. That stuff is vital to, and in some ways is almost as vital as the stories themselves, because here you can physically hold the history of television in your hand to some extent. But they either didn't have the space, or there was a budgetary problem, or it just, that's not what we're about. I would hear that. It's not what we do. I called the Museum of Broadcasting and offered them what I had. They didn't have any interest, not what we do. I'd hear that a lot. So I would just hold on to everything that I had, thinking, that I would build a website one day when I had the time, and of course, still working on the same book that I worked on 40 years ago, but so I don't have the time. But I always thought I would, build something like that when I could.
Do you think these interviews being on video distinguishes them from the audio in a significant way? Is there, in today's technology, does the video add a significant component to them?
Get to see what they look like, right? That, by the way, is our dog needing to go out for a walk.